Hey, so this is kind of a wild story, and I think you're going to love it. It's about a woman, Josephine, who, on the outside, seemed like your typical creative, quietly ambitious person, always dreaming, always building, but seriously underestimated by her family. They thought she was a failure, a dreamer who would never make it. But here's the twist. Everything they believed, totally wrong. And, well, the public reveal that flips everything on its head is something you won't see coming. So, growing up, Josephine's life was, well, it was complicated, to say the least. Her dad, Gary, had this way of measuring everything in numbers, commissions, sales, trophies, you name it. And in his world, Josephine was less than. He called her a useless dreamer when she was just 10. Yeah, 10. There was this one weekend where she had spent hours, days, really building a detailed diorama from her favorite fantasy book. Tiny hand-painted clay figures, every tree, every castle painstakingly made. And she was so proud, but when her dad saw it, he just sighed. A heavy, disappointed sigh that stuck in her memory. He said, pretty bluntly, "Pretty things don't pay the bills. You've got to be a winner, not a dreamer." It was like that phrase just became the soundtrack of her childhood. Meanwhile, her older brother Harry, total opposite, natural athlete, confident, got the pats on the back, new sports gear, the car for his 16th birthday. Everything came easy for him, and in her family's eyes, he was always the golden child. He had the straightforward path: sports, business school, then a fancy career in sales, and everyone just assumed he'd succeed, no effort required. The contrast, brutal. Josephine, on the other hand, was quiet, artistic, more into patterns and coding than socializing or chasing trophies. She didn't fit the family mold, and honestly, she wasn't trying to, but that just made her seem like less. Her mom, Lydia, loved her, she really did, but her love came with strings attached, subtle ones. She'd praise Josephine's drawings, sure, but only when her dad wasn't around. And if he walked in, conversation would shift. Quick. "Your father just wants what's best for you, dear," she'd say. And everyone in the family knew what that really meant. Keep quiet. Don't rock the boat. Her mom's whole role seemed to be holding the peace, even if it meant letting Josephine feel small, letting her self-esteem take hits so the household wouldn't erupt. That pattern became normal. Praise, but quietly. Correction, loudly. Conditional love, wrapped in practicality. Things didn't get easier as she got older. When she announced she was going to study computer science, focusing on human-computer interaction, her dad scoffed. Really? Scoffed. "So, you're going to make video games. How's that going to help you buy a house?" And Harry jumped in, laughing. "Don't worry, Joe. You can always design the logo for my first dealership." They didn't get it. They didn't want to. Her world patterns, interfaces, technology, empathy was invisible to them. To them, it was just weird computer stuff, a hobby, a dead end. Looking back, you can see how it all stacked up. Every small success she had was overlooked. Every choice she made, dismissed. Her dad's words, her brother's easy victories, her mom's quiet complicity. They all wove together this narrative that she was destined to fail, a dreamer lost in her own head. And, okay, maybe a part of her internalized that too, but it also quietly built something else: a determination, a a sort of undercurrent of resolve that one day she'd prove them wrong, even if she had to do it in her own way, quietly, without them noticing. It was the perfect mix of doubt, dismissal, and quiet, stubborn ambition. So, after years of being labeled the useless dreamer, Josephine decided to take a path that actually made sense to her computer science, with a focus on human-computer interaction. Basically, she wanted to make technology that actually worked for people, not just, fancy lines of code that looked impressive on paper. And here's the thing, this wasn't some whim. She was fascinated by the patterns, the way interfaces could shape behavior, make people feel understood. It was her thing, her zone, the place where she could actually build something meaningful. But explaining it to her family, that was a whole other level. Dinner conversations were brutal. She'd say, "I'm designing the user experience for this app, so it helps freelancers manage projects and finances more intuitively." And immediately, eyes would glaze over. Her dad would just grunt, shake his head. Harry would snicker like it was a joke. Her mom would smile softly, the kind of smile that was more like an apology for living in that house. "So, you're making video games again?" her dad would ask, every single time she mentioned her work. And Josephine would try to clarify, trying not to sound defensive. "It's not a game. It's about real problems, real people trying to organize their work. It's about empathy and efficiency." And then the silence, the blank stare, and that heavy, familiar sigh of disappointment. It wasn't that they didn't care, or maybe they did, in their own way, but they just couldn't see it. The things she cared about, the things she built with her own two hands. They didn't measure in commissions or trophies or sales numbers. To them, she was still the little girl who made dioramas instead of playing soccer, the useless dreamer. And honestly, that label hurt. It hurt because they were wrong, and she knew it. She could feel the potential simmering inside her, this quiet, stubborn belief that she could actually make something real, something that mattered. And that's when the app came into play. Josephine had been tinkering with it for months. In the quiet hours after work, after evenings spent coding and designing at the startup she worked for. It was a tool for freelance artists to manage projects, track finances, and actually get paid on time, a problem she had wrestled with herself. And she was proud, of course, but telling her family terrifying. She wanted them to understand, but also knew that their understanding was almost impossible. Still, she tried, with the sort of polite optimism that only comes from years of being dismissed. "It's more than an app, Dad. It solves a real problem for a lot of people," she said, keeping her voice small, careful. And his response, classic. "The only problem you should be solving is your own bank account. You can't even pay your own bills without a roommate. You've always been a useless dreamer, and you always will be." Yep, that line, straight out of childhood, recycled and applied to adulthood. And she just, emotionally checked out that day. She smiled politely, nodded, and decided she wasn't going to argue. No point. Her energy went into her work, her code, her little project, her secret life of building a future her family couldn't even imagine. It was frustrating. Yes, isolation is a weird mix of freeing and lonely. She loved her job. She really did. But having that constant reminder that, in their eyes, she was failing, it got to you. It made her second-guess herself sometimes. Wonder if she really was wasting her time. But there was something else brewing under the surface, a quiet determination. The sense that one day, somehow, all of this, her work, her effort, her unseen victories would speak louder than the words that had haunted her childhood. At the startup, Josephine poured herself into learning everything, from coding practices to interface design, from managing projects to understanding user behavior. It was grueling work, low pay, long hours, but she was absorbing knowledge like a sponge. And outside the office, the app became her secret obsession. She refined it, tested it with artists, iterated constantly. She knew it wouldn't be an instant hit, but it didn't matter. She was building something real, something she understood, something she could be proud of without the need for validation from the people who had never really seen her. It's funny, in a way. All the things her family dismissed as weird or useless, they were exactly the things that were shaping her future. Her patience, her attention to detail, her ability to see patterns, to empathize with users, to quietly observe before making a move. These were the skills that would eventually flip the entire narrative. The things that had been painted as weakness, as frivolity, were quietly becoming her strongest tools. And she knew it, even if it was just a whisper in her mind. One day, they'd see. Or maybe not them, exactly, but the world would. Alright, so here's where things really start to spiral. A few years after Josephine had graduated and begun making real strides in her career, there was a phone call that completely shifted everything. It was from her grandfather's lawyer, her grandfather Lydia's dad. A quiet, meticulous carpenter had always been the one family member who actually saw her, who recognized her for what she was. The kind of man who'd look at her drawings and see patience and care, not a lack of practicality. He'd encouraged her, even told her once, "You build worlds, Josie, different tools, same heart." Well, he had passed, and the lawyer's call, that was when the storm hit. Her grandfather had left his entire estate to her. Not a fortune, but a significant inheritance, his house, savings, workshop, the works. A final gesture from someone who had truly believed in her. And she knew instantly, deep down, that this would trigger a reaction she'd spent years bracing for. Her parents, Harry, the whole dynamic, they were not going to take this lightly. Sure enough, the first thing that came was disbelief. Her father, Gary, looked like he'd swallowed a lemon whole. Stiff in his chair, jaw tight. Harry, trying to act casual, but tapping his foot nervously betrayed him. And her mother, Lydia, hands twisted in her lap, eyes darting nervously between them and Josephine. When the lawyer read the will, stating that everything went to Josephine, the silence was deafening. A decade of dismissive remarks, subtle and overt belittlement, all compressed into a single pause. It was heavy, awkward, and, well, charged with anticipation. Harry was the first to speak, sharp, almost frantic. "That's impossible? Grandpa must have been confused. Joe probably manipulated him." And her father nodded, grim, confirming the suspicion. "This is ridiculous. Josephine can barely manage her own finances. What's she going to do with a house and a portfolio? She'll squander it in a year on some artistic nonsense." The audacity, the sheer assumption that she couldn't handle this because of the narrative they had built. It was infuriating, but also strangely empowering. She had anticipated this. She had prepared herself. Their immediate dismissal of her competence, their arrogance, it was all par for the course. And then came the attempts to control it, subtle at first, then increasingly aggressive. Her mother called, voice trembling. "Josephine, your father is just trying to protect the family legacy. Can't you just be reasonable and share it with Harry? You know, he would manage it so much better." "Yeah, sure." Her father cornered her after the funeral. Face calm, tone paternal. "Let me and Harry handle it for you. We'll invest it. Make sure you have a small allowance. You won't have to worry about a thing. We know you're not good with numbers." The insult wasn't just in the offer, it was the presumption. The lifetime of labels folded into one package. They weren't offering help. They were trying to absorb her inheritance, to erase her independence, to make her once again the powerless dreamer. And when she politely refused, everything shifted. Fake concern turned to outright hostility, and soon the lawsuit arrived. Thick packets of legal documents, accusations of undue influence over her grandfather, claims she had coerced him, manipulated him, isolated him from the rest of the family. A work of fiction presented as legal reality. Josephine had a mix of feelings. Fear, yes. Anxiety, definitely. But also a strange thrill. Her family had resources, money, connections. Her father was respected in the business community. Her brother seemingly untouchable. And together they tried to craft a narrative that she had exploited her grandfather. But this, she realized, was also an opportunity. Years of being underestimated, called a useless dreamer, suddenly gave her an edge. They thought she couldn't handle money, couldn't fight for herself, couldn't strategize. That ignorance, that assumption, became a quiet weapon. It was tense. Every phone call, every visit, every discussion about the estate was thick with pressure, with the unspoken understanding that her family was ready to do whatever it took to reclaim what they felt was theirs. And their motives were clear, not just greed, though yes, plenty of that, but desperation. Years of reckless financial choices, of living beyond their means, of failing spectacularly in private while projecting success publicly. They needed the estate, not for pride, not for love. It was survival, packaged as righteous indignation, her emotional state complex, partly sorrow, partly rage, partly that cold, detached calm that comes from realizing you've been underestimated your entire life and that you now hold the very thing they thought you couldn't manage. Every conversation with Samantha, her lawyer, built on this calm resolve. They had handed her a storm wrapped in the guise of a family feud. She wasn't going to fight blindly. She was going to let their arrogance and greed, their underestimation, do most of the work for her. The discovery process was grueling. Hours of deposition, questions designed to corner her, to catch her in a lie, to paint her as financially incompetent. She answered truthfully, yes, but carefully. She never volunteered more than necessary. Her family's statements, intended to be damning, were starting to lay out their own undoing. Josephine was learning, slowly, to see the threads in the tapestry, the way their own arrogance and assumptions were weaving the narrative that would ultimately work against them. And through it all, the emotional weight was immense. Here was her family, the people who were supposed to support her, turning on her in the pursuit of money and perceived entitlement. And yet, There was a strange clarity in it. The betrayal, the dismissal, the condescension, it had always been there, waiting to be seen for what it was. This inheritance wasn't just a gift from her grandfather, it was, in many ways, a catalyst. A moment where the story could shift, where she could finally reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from her for decades. And even as the documents piled up, even as the legal threats loomed, Josephine felt that quiet, simmering certainty they didn't know the half of what she could do. They had no idea that the dreamer they had mocked was about to become the architect of her own vindication. All right, so this is where things really start to get tense and kind of thrilling. In a quiet, almost sneaky way. Josephine knew she couldn't face her family alone. They had money, connections, and a whole legal team ready to paint her as incompetent, manipulative, you name it. That's where Samantha came in. Sharp, precise, someone who didn't just react, she anticipated, calculated, planned. From the first meeting, you could tell she saw the storm coming and already had a blueprint to ride it out. Their first move was Marcus's investigation into the family finances. And wow, what a gold mine. Josephine had always suspected her father. Gary wasn't as savvy as he projected, but the depth of his mismanagement was staggering. High-risk investments that tanked, cash blown on a friend's failed restaurant, retirement accounts nearly drained, basically, a facade of financial mastery hiding panic and reckless desperation. And Harry, Harry's success was even shakier. His luxury car, designer clothes, lavish vacations, it was all debt, stretched to the max to keep up appearances. The more Marcus dug, the clearer it became they didn't just want the inheritance, they needed it. Their lives were teetering, and the estate was a lifeline. Understanding their motives was only part of the battle. The other part was proving it, and that's where Josephine's skills came into play. As a UX designer, she had this uncanny ability to track patterns, notice behaviors, and connect dots invisible to most people. She applied that to the case, using open source intelligence, public records, social media, even timestamps and geotags. Every slip her family made online, every post flaunting luxury they couldn't afford, became a breadcrumb. Harry, for instance, posted pictures of a yacht vacation just 2 days after a significant cash deposit from her grandfather. Then came the top-of-the-line golf clubs. Same week. Each photo, each post, each brag became evidence of a pattern of recklessness and deception. Josephine meticulously built a timeline, cross-referencing deposits with expenditures, posts with bank statements. It was kind of satisfying quiet, under-the-radar satisfaction to watch their arrogance and carelessness essentially write the script for their own downfall. It wasn't vindictive. Well, maybe a little, but mostly it was strategic. They had underestimated her, thought she couldn't handle the complexity, and she turned that ignorance into leverage. Her father, Gary, was trickier. Minimal online footprint, careful, controlled. But Josephine remembered a tablet she had set up for him years ago. Legally, ethically, yeah, a bit murky, but she had pre-existing authorized access. She logged in, not to hack, but to check emails. And what she found? Jaw-dropping. Pleas to brokers, angry exchanges with failed investments, and then the smoking gun emails between him and Harry plotting the lawsuit, spelling out how they'd frame Josephine as incompetent. Black and white, no guesswork needed. Every word they thought would stay hidden was there, and she had it. Then came the grandfather's old desktop, tucked away and forgotten. Using her skills in data recovery, Josephine unearthed files that were a treasure trove. Financial records, meticulously kept, and then a folder labeled Josie. Every single email she'd ever sent her grandfather, from college updates to early design projects. And inside, a simple text file dated just weeks after she helped him organize bills and set up payments. In it, he wrote about Harry's betrayal and Josephine's competence, expressing pride in the worlds she had been quietly building. That file, honestly, was the linchpin. The proof that not only was she capable, but that her grandfather knew it all along. She brought everything to Samantha: the timelines, the incriminating emails, the grandfather's digital diary. Samantha's reaction was priceless, a mix of awe and sheer tactical satisfaction. "They have no idea," she said, voice low, conspiratorial. "Your so-called useless skills just handed us the gun, the bullets, and a signed confession." And that moment, for Josephine, was profound. The skills her family had mocked: attention to detail, patience, pattern recognition, technical savvy, were the very tools that now ensured her victory. Every step, from Marcus investigations to her own digital sleuthing, was a slow, methodical dismantling of the narrative that had kept her labeled as the dreamer, the incompetent one. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense, but it was deeply satisfying. The quietest, most underestimated skills, the ones everyone else had dismissed for decades, were now her most potent weapons. And the best part, her family had no clue. They were still operating under the old assumptions, blind to the fact that the dreamer they had laughed at for years was now the one quietly running the show. Okay, so now we're in the courtroom. Josephine had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing really prepares you for the real thing. The room was exactly as she pictured: solemn, intimidating, with that faint smell of old paper and floor polish. Her family sat across from her, trying to look like a united front. But there was this tension underneath, a subtle twitch in Harry's foot, the tight jaw of her dad, Lydia's hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. They wouldn't look at her, and honestly, neither did she at first. The anticipation itself was a weapon, in a way. The trial opened, predictably, with their lawyer, Mr. Davies, giving a dramatic, almost theatrical presentation. He painted Josephine as this aimless, financially clueless artist who had somehow manipulated her aging grandfather, exhibited her old bank statements showing modest earnings, a simple apartment, the narrative they'd built for years. As each document was displayed, her family nodded solemnly, masks of concern plastered on their faces. They looked so sure, so smug. And here's the thing: Josephine had to fight the instinct to roll her eyes. You could practically feel their overconfidence radiating from them, like a physical presence. Samantha, on the other hand, was a masterclass in calm. She didn't flinch, didn't react to their smugness. Her cross-examinations were precise, methodical, and, well, quietly ruthless. She let Harry take the stand first. At first, he tried to charm the room, embellishing his relationship with their grandfather, talking about mutual respect and affection. Josephine could see him basking in the assumed credibility of his own story. But then, gently, Samantha began to ask about specifics, dates, amounts, timing. She led him carefully through the evidence Marcus had uncovered, the bank statements, the digital breadcrumbs. Each question was like a scalpel, cutting through the layers of his lies. And Harry started to crack. The confidence that had carried him for years, the smug sense of invincibility gone. He stammered, tried to laugh it off, offered excuses that were completely implausible. Repayment of personal loans, he claimed. Really, every single cash deposit, coinciding with withdrawals from the grandfather's account, suddenly became impossible to explain. His overconfidence, his arrogance, was unraveling in real time. Josephine couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and disbelief. How had they really thought this would work? Next came her father, the supposed responsible patriarch, Mr. Davies was clearly counting on him to be the centerpiece of their case. Deep, authoritative voice, carefully curated words about protecting the family's legacy, painting Josephine as incompetent, naive, even a little manipulative. And then came Samantha. She didn't rush, didn't get aggressive. She asked calm, direct questions, leading him to the contradictions in his statements, the inconsistencies with the financial records, the emails he thought nobody would ever see. Each answer he gave was another brick, falling from the fragile wall of their narrative. Josephine was watching it all, heart pounding, but in a quiet, controlled way. She could feel the tension crackling, the drama building, the stakes, personal, emotional, financial, hanging in the air. Every lie they'd built their story on was slowly collapsing under the weight of meticulous cross-examination and solid evidence. You could see it in their faces, the first flash of doubt, then panic, then disbelief. Their narrative, so carefully constructed over decades, was crumbling right before them. And it wasn't flashy. It wasn't a sudden dramatic reveal. It was this slow, deliberate unspooling. And the suspense was almost unbearable to watch. The emotional stakes were enormous. This wasn't just money, it was vindication, a reclaiming of a lifetime of dignity. The narrative Josephine had been denied. The courtroom felt electric. Each time Samantha presented a piece of evidence, a timeline, a social media post, an email, you could almost hear the internal panic building in her father and brother. They were so used to controlling the story, to being the arbiters of what was true. And now everything was slipping through their fingers. Josephine felt a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief because she was finally being seen as she actually was. Tension because, well, courtrooms are unpredictable and nothing is over until the judge says it is. Samantha's strategy was brilliant. She let them dig their own grave. She allowed them to present their case fully, to overcommit to the lies they'd told for years. By the time she cross-examined, the contradictions were undeniable. She never raised her voice, never lectured. She just asked the right questions at the right time, letting the evidence speak for itself. And it did. Every falsehood, every exaggeration, every assumption of Josephine's incompetence was exposed, slowly but surely. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath as Harry and Gary fumbled through their testimony, their confidence replaced by confusion, shock, and humiliation. Through it all, Josephine stayed composed, calm, observing, her breathing controlled, her expression neutral. The useless dreamer they'd spent decades mocking had become a quiet force, a witness and client ready to reclaim what had always been hers. Every small slip, every reaction, every pause in the room added to the tension. The drama wasn't in a single moment, but in the gradual, almost surgical dismantling of a false narrative. And that's the beauty of it, watching arrogance and overconfidence meet meticulous preparation, seeing them crumble under their own assumptions. It was both satisfying and nerve-wracking, all at once. By the time the morning ended, it was clear. Their confidence had been shattered. The groundwork for Josephine's ultimate revelation, the truth about her success, her competence, and her grandfather's intentions, was laid. Every cross-examination, every timeline, every piece of evidence had chipped away at their fortress of lies, and Josephine could finally see, in very real terms, the power of preparation, patience, and strategy. The stage was set, the tension palpable, and the audience well. Everyone in that courtroom was about to witness the unraveling of a story that had been tightly controlled for decades. All right, so now comes the part Josephine had been waiting for, the moment that would finally flip everything on its head. She walked to the witness stand, heart hammering, every step measured, calm on the outside, but inside total storm. She adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and looked around. Her family was seated across from her, their smug, overconfident faces finally looking a little unsure. Harry's jaw was tight, a faint sweat beading on his upper lip. Her father, Gary, looked rigid, trying to project authority, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. And her mother, Lydia, hands clasped together, face pale, caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. They had built their entire world on a narrative of her failure. And now, well, that world was about to crumble. Samantha leaned in, calm as ever, her eyes locking with Josephine's. "Josephine," she said, in that low, measured tone that always seemed to cut through the tension in the room. "Your father has just testified that you are, and I quote, a useless dreamer who can't even pay your own bills. Is that an accurate description of your current financial situation?" Josephine shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "No, it is not." And just like that, the room shifted. Small murmurs rippled through the public gallery. A single, intentional pause, letting the weight of those words sink in before she continued. "Over the past decade, I've worked at a tech startup, putting in long hours, learning, growing, contributing. The company was eventually acquired, and in my spare time, I developed a personal project and app to help freelance artists manage their projects and finances. It was a passion project, yes, but it solved a real problem, and it built a real community." Mr. Davies, the family lawyer, jumped up, clearly frustrated. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We are here to discuss the management of the estate, not the witness's little hobbies." But the judge, sharp and perceptive, shook her head. "I'm finding this very relevant, Mr. A. Davies. Please continue, Miss Josephine." Josephine took another breath, the tiniest smile touching her lips, and went on. "The app, as I mentioned, was eventually sold 7 years ago." A hush fell over the courtroom. She could see it in their faces, Harry, the smugness fading, replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. Lydia, mouth slightly open, her hand flying to her chest. And her father, well, he looked like the color had drained completely from his face, leaving him gray and slack-jawed. That smug, confident, untouchable expression he had perfected over decades. Gone. Just gone. Samantha interjected at just the right moment. And for how much? Miss Josephine. Her eyes sparkled, a tiny hint of triumph behind the professional calm. Josephine took a steadying breath and stated the number 7 figures, a sum that was utterly unimaginable to the courtroom, and clearly to her family. The gasps were audible. The room went silent. Every single person absorbing what had just been revealed. Mr. Davies froze mid-objection, mouth hanging open. The public gallery was buzzing with whispered reactions. The dramatic payoff hitting like a wave. Harry's face went pale, as if someone had punched him in the stomach. His confident posture collapsed slightly, his eyes darting, looking for an escape that didn't exist. Lydia's hands flew to her mouth, wide-eyed and stunned. A mixture of awe, fear, and something else, betrayal. Maybe, or the realization that she had been complicit in misjudging her daughter for years. And her father, her father. The color drained entirely, leaving that pasty gray pallor. His expression was a study in absolute shock. Not pride, not relief, not even acceptance, just disbelief, horror, and the dawning realization that he had been spectacularly, publicly humiliated. Josephine let the pause stretch, letting every heartbeat in the courtroom sink with the tension. She had practiced restraint, control, but the sheer visual of their shock was like the final, satisfying proof that she had been right all along. She continued, calmly, almost conversationally. For the last 10 years, I have managed my finances, my investments, and my work independently. Contrary to the narrative presented here today, I am not just financially responsible, I am financially successful. The judge, flipping through the folders Samantha had handed her moments earlier, looked up with piercing clarity. Mr. Gary, according to these verified financial statements, your daughter hasn't just been paying her own bills for the last decade. She's been a millionaire for almost 10 years. Silence. Absolute silence. The only sound you could hear was the collective intake of breath, the weight of decades of assumptions shattering in a single moment. Gary's face was a study in complete devastation. The mask of the stern, authoritative patriarch had completely melted away. He had built his identity around being the wise, controlling head of the family, a man who knew who could handle money and who couldn't. And now that foundation had been annihilated in front of everyone. The rest of the trial, as Josephine knew, was basically a formality. Her father's testimony collapsed under the evidence. Harry's lies exposed, and the documents proving their conspiracy. The emails between Gary and Harry plotting to paint Josephine as incompetent were entered into the record. Every word, every plan, every deceitful intention laid bare. Impossible to deny. The emotional impact was, honestly, staggering. Josephine felt relief. Yes, but also a quiet, profound satisfaction. Not revenge, not malice, just validation. Years of being called a dreamer, of being dismissed, of having her work minimized, suddenly validated in the most public, undeniable way. And the courtroom reactions were everything she had imagined and more. Shock, disbelief, muted murmurs. the almost tangible sense of power shifting in the room. She had been underestimated for decades, and now the tables were completely turned. Samantha's calm, methodical approach had amplified the impact. Every cross-examination had been planned, precise, timed perfectly to maximize the dramatic effect. Josephine's own testimony, delivered with poise and clarity, punctuated the unraveling of her family's narrative. The judge, perceptive and commanding, allowed the evidence and the truth to speak, cutting through the smokescreen of their assumptions and lies. And in that moment, Josephine realized something profound. This wasn't just about money or the inheritance. It was about reclaiming her story, reclaiming her identity, proving that the useless dreamer they had labeled her as a child was, in reality, a force to be reckoned with. As she left the stand, the courtroom was silent, but charged with energy. Her family's faces, pale, slack, utterly defeated, contrasted sharply with the calm, controlled satisfaction she felt. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't triumphant in a loud, public sense. It was quiet, deliberate, deeply satisfying. Every ounce of doubt, every word of dismissal they had thrown her way, had been countered by meticulous preparation, strategy, and, yes, a bit of quiet genius. The climactic moment had arrived, and the emotional payoff was complete. Josephine had not only defended herself, but had, in a way, rewritten the narrative of her entire life in front of the people who had doubted her the most. After the trial, life settled into a quiet rhythm, though not without its consequences for her family. Gary, her father, was bankrupted by legal fees, forced to sell the house Josephine had grown up in, the one filled with both cherished and painful memories. Harry, overwhelmed by debt and facing perjury investigations, was fired and ended up working at a small, struggling dealership 2 towns over. And her mother, Lydia, finally worn down by the humiliation and stress, left Gary and moved into a modest apartment, starting a full-time administrative job for the first time in her life. It was harsh, yes, but it also brought a kind of reckoning for everyone involved. A reset forced by truth and consequence. For Josephine, though, the aftermath was quiet, thoughtful, and profoundly satisfying. She didn't touch the inheritance for personal luxury. Instead, she honored her grandfather by creating a charitable foundation in his name for young artisans and tech innovators, dreamers, often dismissed as impractical. Grants, mentorship, resources. She built a framework to help others pursue their passions. She even purchased and renovated a downtown building, turning it into a co-working space and gallery for the foundation's recipients. It was a tangible manifestation of her grandfather's belief in her, a place where creativity thrived, and no one was ever labeled a useless dreamer. Her own life returned to simplicity and routine, yet it was rich in the ways she valued. She stayed in her minimalist apartment, tended her plants, read her books, and continued work as a UX designer, solving problems and building tools that helped real people. The wealth she had once hidden became a tool for impact, not excess. She could focus on meaningful work, on creating, mentoring, and fostering a community, free from the judgments and expectations that had once confined her. She reflected often on the courtroom, on the moment when her father's confident, dismissive gaze collapsed, when Harry's smugness was replaced with shock, When the judge had confirmed what she had always known she was capable, competent, and deserving, the emotions were complex relief. Yes, but also sorrow for the family that could have been, had they been supportive, honest, and less blinded by arrogance and greed. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity. A lifetime of misjudgment had collided with undeniable truth, and the collision had left her free to build her own life. The months that followed were still an adjustment. Her family, once untouchable in their perception of control, struggled with reality. And while part of her acknowledged the poetic justice of their downfall, she didn't dwell on schadenfreude. Life wasn't about punishment. It was about learning, growing, and reclaiming her narrative. Every day she spent mentoring young artists or refining her work, reaffirmed her sense of purpose. She had transformed her grandfather's gift into something enduring, into a legacy that extended far beyond personal wealth. Her routines were grounded yet full of intention. She met with artists and innovators, sharing insights on technology, design, and perseverance. She returned home to her quiet apartment, coded, planned, and created. The city lights outside her window sparkled as reminders of a complex, vibrant world. And in that complexity, she had carved a corner that was entirely hers. A life guided by curiosity, creativity, and integrity. No one could diminish it. No past label could define it. Sometimes she paused to reflect on the courtroom, the revelation, the dramatic shift of power. She remembered the shock, the disbelief, the subtle panic on her family's faces. And while those memories carried a quiet thrill, they were tempered by the human cost, the fractured family relationships, and the realization that validation had finally come at a price. It wasn't a moment of shallow triumph. It was a profound assertion of her truth. She had been underestimated for decades, dismissed and labeled, and now, finally, she was acknowledged for the person she had always been. Josephine often thought of her grandfather, whose quiet confidence in her had never wavered. His final act, leaving her the inheritance and preserving his faith through emails and messages, became her guiding principle. Everything she did, from the foundation to her work, carried a piece of that philosophy: nurture the dreamer, honor the unseen, and build a space where creativity and ambition could thrive without judgment. The lessons were tangible, and they shaped every decision she made. Her life, simple yet profoundly meaningful, became a reflection of intentionality and quiet resilience. She no longer needed to prove herself to anyone. The narrative of the useless dreamer had been replaced with a story she authored, one rooted in accomplishment, integrity, and vision. Every project, every mentorship session, every act of creation reinforced the life she had consciously designed. She had reclaimed her story, not through revenge, but through patience, skill, and the strategic application of her talents. Occasionally, she would sit by her window, gazing at the city below, reflecting on the strange, winding path that brought her here. Childhood of dismissal, the secret years of building, the trials, the courtroom revelations, all of it connected in a narrative of perseverance and eventual validation. Each step, each choice, each effort made in silence had led to this moment of quiet triumph. Her world, constructed deliberately and thoughtfully, was a sanctuary of meaning, creativity, and freedom. And so, in the end, Josephine's life settled into this space, quiet, fulfilled and entirely her own. She continued to create, to mentor, to impact lives, all while maintaining the simplicity and intentionality she valued. The courtroom drama, the inheritance, the confrontation with her family, they were chapters that had served their purpose. The overarching story now was about a life reclaimed, a narrative restored, and a world she had built on her terms. She had been a dreamer, yes, but she had also been the architect of her destiny. And in that realization, there was a profound, enduring peace. Wow. So that was Josephine's story, a reminder that sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who set the stage for your biggest victories. It's wild how perseverance, quiet strategy, and believing in yourself can completely change your story. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, share where you're watching from. And if you like this, hit that like button and maybe subscribe for more stories that make you think. Thanks for sticking around.